Okay, so I'll just like to start by saying that personally, I think collaborating on publications is great, and I must have collaborated with at least 20 different colleagues during my career in publications. But what I'm going to say now is not based on my personal experience, it's based on the experience of the Unrest project, because I think it's more useful to what we're trying to do here. So my colleagues Nina Parish and, former colleagues, and David Clark, who were also colleagues in the Unrest project, can maybe add something themselves. So what have we pledged in terms of publications as part of the DISTER-MEM project? We have pledged 8 collaborative and comparative articles. That's important, because we need to bear that in mind, I think, all the time. Luckily and wisely, it was promised that we would, by David mainly, that we would only submit these papers to peer-reviewed journals, and not that we would publish them. So that helps. But even so, I think that the time scale is quite tight. And also, it was said that in the application that some of the papers may form part of a special journal issue. So we have to bear that in mind as well. So as I said, I'm going to put forward some suggestions, some ideas. You may take them on board, or you may discard them, whatever you prefer. And they are based on the experience of the Unrest project. So something that we found personally, I found very useful, but I'm sure we all did, because in the end we produced we submitted at least 12 articles, I would say many more than we had promised, and most of these have already been published. So what was really useful was that at a fairly early stage we had a meeting, and each of us was asked to come to the meeting with suggestions for one or more collaborative and/or comparative articles based on 2 or more case studies. Now, I understand that the case studies have not been finalized and they have not been studied yet, but I think the more we hear about them, and the more we exchange information about the case studies, as we are doing today in a way, and the more we can already start thinking about possible suggestions for joint papers. So at this joint meeting, that was, I would say, probably around the end of year 1, these suggestions were discussed. Some of them were discarded, mainly because maybe one person suggested to write a collaborative paper around certain topics or themes, and others didn't find that very interesting. But nonetheless, we found sufficient themes for people to agree on a variety of collaborative articles. And for each agreed article, we identified a coordinator. I would say this is absolutely important, who took responsibility for completion within a certain date. This is important because otherwise the momentum is lost, and then you end up very probably not producing these articles when you need them. So at regular intervals, we were asking for updates on the state of submission, so people were saying this is almost completed, this has already been submitted, and etc. So how did we frame the articles? I think it's absolutely vital that we are able to frame and structure the articles, for instance, anchoring each paper to a specific theory or maybe a specific methodology, but there has to be some structure, because presumably the papers will be based on more than one case study, comparing different case studies, and they would become very fragmented unless there is a common frame and structure. So in our case, David Clark introduced the concept of the different memory modes earlier. We definitely worked with these different memory modes. Sometimes we focus on specific aspects, for instance, multi-perspectivity, or attitudes to international diplomacy. So it doesn't have to be, the articles were not necessarily framed around cosmopolitan memory as such or agonistic memory as such, but it went more in depth into aspects connected with such memory frames. Other articles, obviously in our case, the whole Unrest project was underpinned by agonistic memory theory. So in other instances, we deliberately adopted agonistic memory theory as the framework. And then in the paper, we discuss how do we conceive this theory, how can we apply it to these different case studies, how do people react to this memory mode, etc. So the other thing is on what basis did we choose the case studies? And in some cases, you can decide to focus in depth on just maybe 2 case studies. That worked very well, it was done. In other cases, the collaborative paper was more theory-driven, if you like, and so we decided to simply draw a lot of examples from many different case studies. So in this sense, there were very different papers. Also, how do you compare case studies? So in some cases, we compare them because of their similarities. For instance, 2 case studies where a cosmopolitan memory mode had been adopted. So obviously, they would be very comparable in that sense. But in other cases, we chose them precisely because they represented contrasted cases in terms of memory modes. Also, for some articles, we decided to go down a different route, if you like, and to analyze the reasons why certain memory modes were emerging in various contexts. So we made reference, looking for reasons. We had to make reference to the local, national, international context. Obviously, it's already been clear today that all these contexts are very relevant for Distermem. And also we made reference to cultural and socio-political trends. And then finally, we would have been very interested to analyze stakeholders, audiences, or the public, or participants' reactions to the different memory modes. But because the analysis of this kind of analysis came late in the project, in fact, we haven't managed, I don't think we managed to publish papers on evaluation. So my suggestion would be, if you were interested in that kind of papers, then I think evaluating stakeholders, participants' reactions would have to come probably in the second year. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the data for the papers. Okay, in Arrest, and even more so in the Distermem project, we have participants that are from very different backgrounds. Some of them are in academia, but many other are practitioners. And as we already heard, many academics come from different disciplines. So is this a problem, or is this a challenge, or is this an advantage? I would say it can certainly become an advantage. It can enrich the project and also the publications. We didn't seem to have any problem in publishing papers that were clearly interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. But again, the issue is you have to ensure that the papers are coherent. So again, it seems to me very, very important that before writing a paper, you agree on a clear structure, a clear set of questions, or at least a common theoretical framework and or a common methodology. Obviously, it's difficult to publish, let's say, on 2 case studies in which one was research via interviews and the other was research via questionnaires. There has to be some kind of common denominator. So did we have disagreements? Yes, many disagreements. We welcome them because agonism is all about disagreement. Disagreement can be very constructive, and in fact, in the arrest project, we had quite a number of participants who were skeptical, even highly skeptical about agonistic memory. Others were much more enthusiastic. But we managed to negotiate these differences of opinion in ways that I think were positive for producing collaborative papers. So I hope the same can happen here. In terms of journals, where did we submit our papers and why did we choose them? It seems to me that in many cases our criteria was a good quality journal, and that you can look at the impact factor. Maybe you know which journals are most relevant in a certain field. You know yourselves, but we tended to opt for the most appropriate journal for the topic that we had chosen. So in the case of I published a paper with David and with another colleague that was more looking at diplomatic aspects, and so we chose the International Journal of Cultural Policy because it was about cultural diplomacy, and that seemed the more obvious one. If the paper is very much focusing on memory, then obviously memory studies is, to some extent, the journal to go for, but it has a very, very long waiting list, and you may want to consider that. But then the requirement, as I said, is only submitting a paper, so that would be fine. We published, I think, 1, possibly 2 papers in the International Journal of Heritage Studies. That is a very high-quality journal and with a wide international reach. So that was a very good one. You may want to choose to go higher, to aim higher at the beginning, and then maybe. If it is rejected, then go for another type of journal. History and memory was another one where, well, as the title says, if the focus of the paper is not just on memory, but is combining historical context with memory, then history and memory could be a very good one. Other possible journals, we talked today about conflict resolution. So if you take that angle, which is highly possible, then the Journal of Conflict Resolution could be an appropriate one. I found one, a Space and Polity, which is more, if the angle is more geographical, disputed territories, then that seems like an appropriate one. Journal of Peace Research, very high quality journal, very difficult to publish there, but very appropriate one in some cases, I would imagine. And again, the requirement is submission, so that could be targeted as well. Or another one could be conflict management and peace science. So again, it depends very much what is the focus of this particular paper, what kind of academic audience does it speak to, and so which journal should we go for? It's a collaborative decision that needs to be taken. Okay, I mentioned at the beginning the special issue. So what was said in the application was that it may be possible to include some of the 8 articles produced by the project participants in a special issue. So it's left vague. The advantage of the special issue is that, let's say, I mean, Sophie was telling me that in theory, all 8 articles could go in a special issue. And that would solve the problem straight away. There you are, all 8 papers submitted in one single outlet. But it may not be the best way to proceed. So maybe it might be possible to think in terms of a special issue with 3 or 4 of the papers that have been promised, and then add other papers which can be much more varied. For instance, some of them may be just theoretical or just methodological. They don't have to be comparative in this case because they would be extra compared to the 8 papers that were promised. Or here, there could be papers analyzing single case studies. So that could be interesting, I think, an interesting thing to do. But obviously, it would be important to identify the editors of the special issue at an early stage, because we all know, I'm sure, it's not an easy task. And, you know, it's like an edited book, so you have that problem of making sure that everybody submits at the right time. You have to ensure that the quality is high throughout, etc., etc. So hopefully someone will come forward for that role. And also identify which journal and get the special issue agreed. That's not easy either, but it's possible. So is there any rule that says we cannot publish in non-English language journals? Of course not. We can target non-English language journals, but this might require a lot of translation work, unless, let's say, one of the papers could be on case studies that are all within a country, let's say all 3 case studies from within Poland, and the collaborators could all be from, Polish speakers, in which case this would be a collaborative and a comparative paper. It will fit the requirements, and it could be submitted to a Polish journal. Or it may be easier to, if the collaborative articles are, are written by people from different countries, then it may be easier to have, if there are contributions in a language other than English, it's easier to translate those individual contributions. And I understand from Sophie that there is some money for translation work, not very much, but there is. There is money in each work package for translation work. So these barriers can easily be overcome in that case. So peer review, obviously we said that the articles will be submitted to peer review journals, so they will be peer reviewed by the journals, but that is after submission. Because they are all going to be jointly authored, then that is good in many ways, because the collaborators can act as peer reviewers, and this can help improve the quality of the article. But there is a risk here that, you know, we can all become friends, and we don't want to criticize someone else's contribution and so on. But it seems to me we are all in the business of criticizing each other, including our own work, hopefully, all the time. And so, in fact, I think if we do this, then we improve the overall quality of the submission, and it's going to be even more likely that it will be accepted by the journal. So I think that can be a good process. When the peer review is received, unless it's the worst scenario, which is possible. Nowadays is increasingly possible that an article is rejected, but very often the verdict is the famous revise and resubmit, and often is major revisions and then resubmit. So that's fine. And usually that leads to a publication, so it should be viewed as a very positive response. The only thing is that usually they want the resubmission in something like 3-4 weeks. Otherwise, they will consider the resubmission as a new submission. It will be sent to different reviewers, so the process starts all over again, and you may have to wait for months. So it's absolutely important that if they say revise and resubmit, and we expect the resubmission to be within 3-4 weeks, you keep to that deadline, which means that all the collaborators need to be proactive, and they all need to be on board and do their bit, because there is only, as I said, a very limited time. So it's also important to agree very clearly who is going to revise what. So that also has to be agreed beforehand. And last comments. So it's extremely important to establish deadlines. It doesn't mean the deadlines have to be kept. Sometimes someone say, well, someone may be ill, or has been too busy to produce their contribution, but nevertheless, we need deadlines, and then as much as possible, we have to stick to them. I think it's really important that all collaborators understand and agree to the aims and scope of the joint article. So, because if that's not clear, then it's going to be disjointed and it's not to be very coherent. So there has to be some time spent among the collaborators so that they are all on the same wavelength. They say, okay, I understand what we're trying to do with this paper. I understand that we're going to use this kind of common framework. I understand we're all using this methodology, and these are the main arguments we're going to put forward. And then there is the practical question. So how do you proceed to produce a collaborative article? We did it differently, because one coordinator, for instance, who in fact was the coordinator of the whole Unrest project, he was very keen to proceed that he would divide up the article at the beginning. When everybody had agreed what was to be done, he divided the article into various sections, and then he would say, okay, you so-and-so, you produce this section, you produce this other section, you produce this other section. I will write the introduction, the conclusion, and put it all together. And that worked very well. I think he put quite a lot of onus upon him to do this work, but it worked. Whereas another way to proceed was that, let's say, the coordinator of the article writes the introduction and then passes it on to the second person, who writes the next section, and then it gets passed on. And then at the end, before writing the conclusions, everybody reads it all, and if they all agree that it fits together, then they produce the conclusion in a way collaborative. So that's all from me, and good luck.